Welcome to my YouTube channel for Jules Creations. Today I'm going to be going over several techniques for making rolled paper beads and a whole lot more. By the end of this video, you'll know how to make 5 different paper bead shapes, how to control their size, and how to fix the most common problems beginners run into. We'll start with the basics for beginners and then move into more advanced techniques, including measuring, cutting, rolling, adjusting bead size, and multi-layering. We'll also cover roller tools, paper types, decorating, and troubleshooting. And we'll be making 5 different styles of rolled paper beads. By the end of this tutorial, you'll know how to make all of these beads. So why paper beads? Well, they're easy to make, they're lightweight and inexpensive, and a lot of fun to make. They can be beautifully colored and bold or simple and elegant. They're also eco-friendly because we can repurpose paper from magazines, calendars, flyers, and more. Beads can range from something very simple to very complex, depending on how it's cut and rolled or folded together. Not only are paper beads great for necklaces, earrings, and bracelets, but they're also fun for keychains, bag charms, ornaments, bookmarks, and all kinds of creative projects. So what are the different beads we'll be covering today? Tube beads, which is a type of cylinder bead that's long and slender, not tapered. Drum beads, which is also a type of cylinder bead that is short and thick and not tapered. Bicone beads, which are tapered and they come to a pointed tip. Barrel beads, which are tapered and they come to a straight tip. Layer styled beads, which is a combination of one bead plus an added layer to stylize the bead. And multi-layering, which is a technique where we use multiple strips rolled together as one to make a nice thick bead when needed. We'll go over more of that later. And just a note, if you'd like an easy reference for these bead shapes while you're working, I do have printable paper bead shape guide cards, which are available in my shop. Let's talk about supplies. You'll obviously have a few options when selecting supplies. Although you can use scissors for the wider strips of paper, scissor cuts are not always perfectly straight. So I highly recommend a razor knife and a cutting board, especially when cutting very thin pieces to make tiny beads. A razor knife will cut thin, long strips with perfection, but you may also want a pair of scissors around to do a quick snip here or there if needed. Now, to use a razor knife, you'll want to use a self-healing cutting board. This will protect your table and it will heal itself so that it doesn't leave deep cuts in the cutting board. You will also need a ruler to guide the razor knife while you're cutting. And you can use a metal ruler. They're usually about 12 inches long. But if you plan to make a lot of paper beads, I recommend an acrylic quilting ruler. These are see-through so that you can measure from the paper's edge exactly the width that you want, and they're usually longer, which comes in great for very long paper strips used for certain types of beads. Also be aware that a shiny metal ruler can be very slippery, so a coated ruler or a wooden ruler may help to avoid slipping when we cut the beads. We'll be covering different types of paper later, but to get started, let's just use some regular printer paper or scrapbook paper, and small prints work the best. We will need a tool to wrap our bead onto, and we'll talk more about various roller tools later, but for now this can be a bead roller tool or something as simple as a wooden dowel or a knitting needle. So different tools come in different diameters. As you see here, using different tools will make the holes larger or smaller. But size-wise, if you use the same width of paper strip, it will look very similar. So look at the diameter of the tool you choose, and that will be the hole size for the bead you're making. We will need some clear drying liquid glue, and we have a few options. If we pour it onto the bead directly from the squeeze bottle, chances are we'll have a big blobby mess. The paper beads only need a tiny drop at the end of each bead, so a little paintbrush with some glue can work. For this, we would use a small piece of foil and make a little tray, pour a little glue in there, and then use a paintbrush. Or you can also use a small squeeze bottle with a needle tip like this. These can be found at most craft stores or on Amazon. I like the needle tip because it minimizes how much glue pours out at one time, and it's always ready to go, whereas the glue in the foil tray will dry out. So here are the supplies that we will need for this tutorial. A few pieces of paper, plain printer paper for practice, and or pretty paper like scrapbook paper. Small prints work the best for this. Plus one piece of paper to lay down on our work area. A razor knife, a self-healing cutting board, clear drying liquid glue, non-toxic of course, aluminum foil and a paintbrush or a needle tip with a squeeze bottle. And for the squeeze bottle, you'll also want a small cup with a napkin inside that we can make damp, and that will keep the squeeze bottle from drying out. You'll want a ruler. We talked about different kinds of rulers. We'll want a writing pen to mark our measurements. Optionally, some scissors for a little snip here or there, and a rolling tool. This can be a bead rolling tool or a set of them, or a knitting needle or wooden dowel. We'll go over more tools later. But for beginners, something between a 1/8 inch and a 1/4 inch in diameter works the best. Optionally, some baby wipes or wet naps can be used to wipe the glue off your fingers. Now, if you're using the squeeze bottle with the needle tip for the glue, you'll find that the tip dries out pretty quickly. But since we're doing quite a bit of gluing, we want to prevent that. So here's a little tip. What I do is I take a small cup and I fold and lay in a napkin at the base of it and flatten it out. And then I spray it a few times with water. You can also, of course, run it under water and then squeeze it out and put it in there. On the squeeze bottle, I don't want to lose the cap, so I leave it connected, but then it gets in my way. So I keep a rubber band around the bottom of it, and when I'm using the bottle, I just slip the cap under the rubber band. Then I place the bottle with the tip down into the wet napkin, and the cup holds it from falling over, and the moisture in the napkin keeps it from drying out. So let's go over some roller bead basics. First, we need a tool to roll our paper bead onto. And if you plan to make a lot of paper beads, I highly recommend getting a set of bead rollers. They make rolling so much easier. But if you don't have any bead roller tools, you can also use an object that has a long rod shape, such as a knitting needle or skewer, a rounded pencil like a pastel pencil. They all come in different sizes, but for starting off, I suggest a diameter of about a 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch. First, let me show you an example of rolling a basic paper bead. This is going to be a tube bead. A tube bead is a type of cylinder-shaped bead. It's one of the more simple shapes of paper beads. And it looks pretty simple, right? So let me explain what's happening a little bit more. So for this bead, I used a paper bead roller tool. In a minute, I'll also show you how to do this without a bead roller tool. So we take a long strip of paper and slide one end of it into the slot. Now you can hold it with the paper on top or on bottom. I like to hold it with the strip on top so I can see what it's doing as I'm rolling the bead. To start the bead, we turn the tool very slowly till the paper wraps all the way around, plus a little extra. Once it's secure, we can start turning it a little faster. And we'll want to keep the strip tight, pulling away from the bead roller so the tension will keep the bead from unraveling. As we roll, we'll want to keep the paper strip centered. When we get to that last inch or so of the bead, we add a little bit of clear drying liquid glue and then finish off rolling until the bead is done. Now we probably have some extra glue oozing out, and that's normal. Just wipe off the extra with your fingertip. The way I do it is I slide my fingertip over the end of the bead and gather up the extra glue, and then slide up to the middle part of my finger to hold the bead in place until the glue sets for a few seconds. Now we need to continually hold the bead closed until the glue sets, otherwise it may come uncoiled when we let go and we'll have to start over. And just a note, if you're using glossy paper such as calendar paper, it takes a bit longer for the glue to set. When we remove the bead, we'll want to slide it up from the bottom as close to the tool as possible to avoid pushing the bead itself out of shape. And the glue on our finger can be wiped off onto our paperwork area, or this is where a wet nap might come in handy. Now that was using our slotted bead rolling tool. The slot holds our paper in place as we start the bead rolling. Now let me show you how this works using a plain rounded tool. Knitting needles are great because they come in all different diameters, and they also work well for extra wide beads. Without the slot, the paper can't be anchored, so we have to clamp the paper onto the tool with our fingers to keep it from slipping. To get started, we want to pre-curl the end of our strip first, like this. That makes it much easier to begin rolling. Now we hold the paper down with our thumbs and use our forefingers to roll the tool. We want the bead to be snug on the tool, but not too tight, because if it's too tight, it can be difficult to slide it off when we're finished. When we get to the end, we add a small amount of glue and then hold the end down for several seconds until the glue sets. We use our finger to gently wipe away any extra glue before it dries. One last note, on the tube bead, once the bead is removed from the roller, we can press the ends inward toward the center to help keep the sides flat. We can do this with our fingers, or we can use something flat like a small acrylic sheet. So that is the basic paper bead rolling technique, but there are also many varieties of paper bead shapes and sizes depending on how the paper is cut and the tool we use, and if we're rolling it or folding it or whatever. And here's a basic rule of thumb. The last 1.5 inch of the strip will be the most visible on the bead. So we'll want to start rolling from the opposite end so that the pretty colors are the last part to be rolled. Now let's go over some rolling tools, including slotted bead roller tools and some household alternatives. We can use almost any smooth round object as a rolling tool as long as it's straight and not tapered, kind of like a rod. We just use those tools a little bit differently from the slotted bead roller tools. Now here's a few examples of rolling tools you might find around the house. A wooden dowel, crochet hooks, a stylus, a wooden skewer, a rounded chopstick, metal or bamboo knitting needles, an unsharpened round pencil, a long smooth metal nail. We can use a round toothpick for tiny, tiny beads, or even a thick plastic straw as long as it doesn't bend easily, and straws are great if we want a large hole. Or, of course, we can buy a set of slotted bead roller tools. There's a huge advantage to using actually slotted bead roller tools. Slotted bead rollers come in a variety of diameters, as you can see here, and the edge of the paper strip can fit in the little slot, and the slot will catch the edge to keep it in place while we start rolling. And we don't have to keep clamping the paper down onto the roller with our hands, which makes it way easier to roll. And if you plan to make a lot of paper beads, you'll definitely want a set of actual slotted paper bead rollers. The paper bead rollers I have are pretty old, and I don't see them on Amazon anymore, so you may have to search a little bit, but I have seen them recently on Etsy and eBay as well. Just make sure that the pin part is at least an inch long or more, and if it's a set, you should have a variety of diameters. Be aware that most quilling tools have a very short pin, so they usually don't work too well for paper beads unless you're making little tiny beads. The slotted bead roller set that I have has 6 sizes, but I find that I only use these 4 main sizes: 3 32-inch, 5 32-inch, 3 16th-inch, and 1/4 inch. For some reason, the 5 32-inch seems to be my favorite size. These diameters all create hole sizes that work really well for most metal grommets. Grommets, also called eyelets, are metal rings that can be added to the ends for decoration and strength, and we'll talk more about those later. Now for this video, I'll be using mostly the slotted bead roller tools because they're much easier and faster, and I'd rather be focusing on what I'm showing you than the tool I'm using. Now let's talk about paper. Since paper comes in all different weights, let's talk about how that affects our beads. Regardless of how thick the paper is, we can always adjust the thickness of the bead by adjusting the length of the paper strip we cut. In addition, we can adjust the width of the bead by adjusting the width of the paper we cut. Let me show you. Here we have 2 identical cut paper strips. One is regular printer paper, which is 24 pound, and the other is a thicker presentation paper, which is 48 pound. So it's about twice as thick. We're going to roll both of these the same way using the same tool. I'll speed this part up a little just so that you can clearly see the difference. So you can see that even with the exact same strip size, beads can still come out differently because thicker paper builds up faster as we roll. Here's another rule of thumb for the width of the bead. The paper strip width equals the paper bead width. So if our strip is a 1/2 inch wide, our bead will be a 1/2 inch wide. And if our strip is a 1/4 inch wide, our bead will be a 1/4 inch wide. And one more rule of thumb regarding the thickness of the bead. The longer the strip is, the thicker the bead will be. In reverse of that, the shorter the strip is, the thinner the bead will be. And I know I just threw out 2 rules of thumb right away, but those are the best ones to remember on how to control the width and the thickness of your bead. So if you can memorize those, then that will help you with adjusting the size of your bead while you're cutting the paper strips. So if we want the bead to be thicker, we roll with more paper. And if we want it thinner, we roll with less paper. One way to think about it is the length of the strip controls how thick the bead becomes. The width of the strip controls how wide the bead becomes. If we want a batch of beads to match in size, the trick is to keep all the strips cut the same size using the same type of paper. For example, if we want this small bead to match the larger one in thickness, we need to roll with more paper, meaning we need to use a longer strip, or we can add another strip to it and then just continue rolling. And now we know how to adjust bead thickness and width so we can match sizes for earrings, necklaces, bracelets, or other projects. The size of paper beads can vary based on four things: the width of the paper strip, the length of the paper strip, the diameter of the rolling tool, and the thickness of the paper. But if we use the same rolling tool and the same paper for the entire batch, that removes two variables, and that leaves us with just the width and the length for us to adjust. So again, if we make a batch of beads using the same paper thickness and the same diameter of the tool, and we cut the strips matching the same width and same length, then all the rolled beads will match in size. Now we're going to cut a few paper strips. We're not measuring yet, we're just practicing cutting. So let's start by figuring out how wide we want to have our bead. And for this practice, we'll make some strips about 1/4 inch wide. First, we lay down our self-healing cutting mat, and then we place our paper on top. We'll place our ruler on top of the paper. And for now, we're just estimating about 1/4 inch strip. Don't worry about perfection. We want to hold the ruler down firmly so that it doesn't slip and keep our fingers safely away from the cutting edge. Start by placing our razor knife against the edge of the ruler at the top, with the blade laying flat and parallel to the paper. If we angle the blade downward too much, it can catch the paper and cause it to tear instead of slicing cleanly, especially if the blade is dull. Now we'll run the razor knife along the ruler in one smooth cut all the way down to the end. And that's our first strip. You may want to practice this a couple of times if this is new to you. And if you want to use pretty paper instead of plain paper, that's totally fine too. And in our next chapter, we'll start measuring our strips intentionally so we can control the bead size. Now that we've practiced cutting strips, let's talk about measuring. Measuring helps us get the exact size we want, and it makes it much easier to create consistent bead sizes for earrings, necklaces, and matching sets. I'll be showing you how to measure with a solid ruler and with a clear ruler. We're going to start by measuring a strip that's 1.5 inches wide. For the solid rulers, such as wood or metal, we place the ruler at a right angle to the edge of the paper, and then slide the ruler until the measurement we want lines up with the edge of the paper, in this case 1.5 inches. So now we use a pen or a pencil to mark a small mark at the end of the ruler, and that's our first mark. Then we slide the ruler up a few inches along the edge and make a second mark the same way. Now those two marks show us exactly where the cut line will be. So we line up our ruler to the two marks and cut straight along the ruler, or we can draw a cut line first if you prefer. And now we have a clean 1.5 inch strip. Now let's measure using the clear acrylic ruler, and you'll see why I recommend these if you plan to make a lot of beads. So this time we'll do a 1-inch strip. So find the 1-inch mark on the ruler and then line the ruler up so that the 1-inch mark sits right on the edge of the paper like this. Now we can cut straight along the ruler, no markings needed. So you see how much faster and easier this is. So once we know the width that we want, we can experiment with different strip lengths to get the thickness that we like. I recommend just using plain paper for experimenting. And remember, if we keep our paper thickness and rolling tool the same, strips cut the same size will roll into beads the same size. Now that we know how to measure strips intentionally, we're ready for our first project, making basic tube beads in different sizes. Before we start our project, let me show you a little trick. So we may have a calendar page or flyer or whatever, and as we know, the last 1.5 inches of the paper is what we see the most on the end of the bead. But what if we have a really pretty part like a butterfly that's not on the end? Well, technically, we could cut it and put the butterfly at the end, but then the length of the strip would be shorter, which would then make a thinner bead, so it wouldn't match all the other beads in the batch. So how do we use this pretty part at the end of the strip, but still keep the length the same, so that when we roll it, the thickness of the bead will stay the same? Well, first we'll cut it so that the colors are on the end, and then we're going to use the cut-off strip first, and then we'll add the pretty paper afterward. So we're using the entire strip, which will keep the same thickness. So starting with the cutoff strip, we start rolling and glue it down. And this strip is a little bit wider, so I'm using 2 fingers instead of 1 to hold the pressure on it until the glue sets. And it is glossy, so we need to hold it just a little bit longer. And now we're going to add our pretty piece. And we add a little glue on the end of the paper, and we're going to line it right up to the edge of the last strip we added. Hold it down for a bit for the glue to start setting. And because we don't have a slot to hold our paper strip, we're going to use the same technique we did with our knitting needle tool. We're going to hold it manually while we gently roll it around and get it started. And then once we've rolled it once around and a little bit extra, then we can tighten it up a little by rolling the bead roller. Then just continue rolling. Roll it to the end while keeping it centered. And then we just glue it down, wait for the glue to set. See, now we have all these pretty colors at the end. So we slide it off. And because this is a tube bead, we do want to level off the ends. And now we've made this beautiful bead for the middle of our necklace. So now we know how to select special areas of our bead strip to put them on the ends of the strips. And the technique for adding paper strips can also come in handy when we want to add an extra strip to thicken up our bead. In our next chapter, we'll be doing a project so you can really get a hands-on feel for how to make the paper bead shapes. Very quickly before we start our project, I wanted to mention if you're interested, I just released some downloadable guide cards in a PDF file available for purchase at my shop. These cover the 5 bead styles that we're doing in this tutorial. Okay, on to our project. The purpose of this project is to practice measuring, cutting, and rolling basic tube beads and a drum bead. And we'll be able to see how measuring paper strips intentionally can make a drastic difference. Now remember our rule of thumbs. The width of the strip controls how wide the bead will become, and the length of the strip controls how thick the bead will become. So we're going to make a short, fat drum bead in the middle, and then 2 long, skinny beads called tube beads to complement it. Drum beads and tube beads are made exactly the same way, only the measurements are different. We can use plain paper or pretty paper for this project. So here's what we're going to cut. We want 1 strip at a 1/2 inch wide by 10 inches long, that will be for the drum bead, and 2 strips at 1 inch wide by 5 inches long, which will make our tube beads. So go ahead and grab your paper, plain paper or pretty paper, and cut the 3 strips in these sizes. Pause the video here, and then when you're ready, we'll start our project. If you'd like to revisit Chapter 2 to review the rolling technique, feel free, and then come right back. Now we haven't talked about thick paper yet, but this paper is a bit thick. So I use a spray bottle to just lightly mist the back of it and immediately wipe it off to soften the paper so it will roll easily. We'll start rolling slowly until the paper wraps around and grabs. I'm going to use my index finger as a guide to keep the edges aligned. As we roll, we want to keep the strips centered so the edges line up evenly. And we also want to keep the strip snug, pulling slightly away from the tool. This is the tricky part. We want just enough tension to keep the bead from loosening as we roll, but not too much tension because we still need the bead to slide off the tool when we're done. When we get to the end, we add a small amount of glue, making sure the glue reaches all the way to the edges. We press the edge down firmly into place and slide our fingertip over the end to wipe off any excess glue. Then slide our finger up to the middle of our finger, holding the end in place until the glue sets. And this paper's a little bit glossy, so I'll need to hold it a bit longer than usual for the glue to set. Once the glue is set, we'll gently remove the bead by sliding it off from the bottom as close to the tool as possible so that we don't push the middle of the bead itself, because that would squish the bead out of shape. These beads are all flat on the end, so we want to make them as level as possible. We can either gently squeeze the ends inward with our fingers or press the bead with something flat like an acrylic sheet or a piece of wood. So now go ahead and pause the video and roll up the other 2 paper strips and glue them, and come back when you're done. Welcome back. Now, by looking at the beads, can you guess which one is the tube bead and which one is the drum bead? Well, the short fat bead is the drum bead, and the longer skinny bead is the tube bead. So, as we can see, the strip of paper that was narrower gave us a narrow bead, while the other two beads are wider, making them look more like a tube. And the strip of paper that was longer gave us a thicker bead, while the other two shorter strips of paper gave us thinner beads. So now we know how to cut and measure strips intentionally. We understand how paper strip width and length affect the bead size. We know how to roll with a slotted bead roller tool and with an alternate rolling tool. We also know how to make drum beads and tube beads. Now that we understand the basics of how to control bead size, let's move on to one of the most fun parts of paper beads, choosing the paper. The type of paper that we use can completely change how the bead looks, how it rolls, and how it finishes. We can make paper beads from almost any paper. Let's go over some ideas of different types of paper that can be used for paper beads. We can use junk mail ads. We can use old calendars. They have pretty colors. Here's another calendar with some beautiful colors. We can use advertisements that come in the mail. Here's another mailer in different colors. This is a credit card application that came in the mail, and this pattern will make some really nice beads. We can use Japanese paper. This is some paper I purchased on Etsy, which is really beautiful detail and has metallic accents. We can search for free downloadable printables or print our own colored images. Scrapbook paper comes in all kinds of colors and patterns. This one has metallic flowers and leaves. This one is simple and colorful. We can use origami paper, which come in all kinds of colors and designs. We can use plain colored cardstock, and they can come in all kinds of colors. We can buy paper at the craft store. These are some holographic papers, metallic. They have several different patterns on them. And this one has a bunch of stars. We can use some food package boxes. These are some from tea boxes and popcorn boxes mixed in with this magazine paper. Old magazines will give tons and tons of different colors and shapes and sometimes some really wild patterns. And they make some really beautiful beads. We can buy pre-cut paper on the internet, on Etsy. These are some that came with a purchase I made, and they're all cut and ready to use. Templates are another option. Templates are pre-measured printable PDF files or image files that are designed for specific bead styles, although many of them can be used for other bead shapes as well. There are also some free templates that you can download, such as the ones on my blog site, as well as additional templates that are available in my shop. And many templates also include colored or patterned papers or have the colors and patterns built directly onto the template itself. Wrapping paper also works very well. Papers with small patterns often show up really nicely on the beads. Just make sure that it's regular weight wrapping paper, not the very thin or slippery types. Now that we've looked at some places to find paper, let's talk about how different papers behave when rolling the beads. Now, all paper come in different thicknesses. For example, boxes from packages like tea are thicker, but still bendable, so we can still use them. Magazine pages or origami paper are very thin, and we can use thin paper to give us thin beads. And there's also a way to use thin paper to give us thicker beads, which I will show you. I'll be using a 5/32-inch size roller. This is my favorite because it's not tiny, but it's small enough to make the hole so it will fit a fine chain or thin cording. Now this is a strip of thin magazine paper that I quickly cut out, and I can use a thicker tool, and that can make a little bit larger bead, but sometimes the thin paper creates beads that are much thinner than we really want. One way to fix that is a technique called multi-layering. As you see, when you roll the thin paper all the way down, it's not a lot of wrapping, but at the end it doesn't really have much thickness, and there are times when we may want that. But if we want a thicker bead, we can double up the layers, and what we can do is use another piece of paper and cut it to the same identical size. Now, these are not perfectly cut. I'm just showing you for examples, but when you use two or more identical layers and you treat them as if they're one strip, this is called multi-layering. So instead of using two layers of pretty paper, which is wasteful because we don't see it all, we can just cut a matching sized piece of plain paper and then lay the pretty paper on top of the plain paper and roll the two pieces as one. So you see how that's a much thicker bead? And we didn't have to double up on our pretty paper. And then at the end, we would just glue down both the plain paper and then the pretty paper layers. I've heard it suggested that the two strips can be glued together before rolling them, but in actuality, that doesn't work. Since the layers roll at slightly different rates, gluing them can prevent the paper from shifting naturally, and it can create a bulky spot while rolling. Now, because they roll at a different rate, normally we end up with a little extra paper on the end on the under layer, so we could just trim that off. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to do a multi-layering technique with four strips of paper the same size. They're just scissor cut to quickly show you. So I take all four strips and line them up on the edge where they're going to start rolling. And then getting started, we start rolling. And you can see how fast it's getting thick because we have multiple layers. And then here at the end, since each layer rolled at a different rate, we'll always have some left over at the end. So we can just trim that off. And then we need to glue down each layer one at a time. Like I said, I'm not making this perfect, just to give you an idea how the multiple layers act when they're rolled together. And you can see how thick that is. Again, this technique is called multi-layering. Now, really thin paper also works well on layer-styled beads. This is done by making a bead with a flat area, such as a tube bead or a barrel bead, and then adding a layer of pretty paper over that flat area. And the bead and the overlayer can be different colors if you like to complement each other. And I'll cover this bead style more a little bit later. So when we're choosing paper, here are a few things to consider. 1, how thick the paper is. 2, how glossy or coated it is. 3, how stiff or soft it feels. And 4, how the pattern will look once it's rolled. So let's revisit these. Number 1, how thick the paper is. Thin to medium paper is the easiest to work with, and it rolls easy and cuts easily. Thicker paper, such as cardstock, can work well, but is best used for thicker, chunkier beads. When cutting with a razor knife, you may need to run across the slice a couple of times to get it all the way through the paper. Another thing with thicker paper is that when rolling it, the paper may be stressed and therefore make bend marks. And what we can do is very lightly spray a fine mist of water on the backside and then wipe it off right away. And that will soften the paper just a little, so it will make it easier to roll without bend marks. Another technique that some people like is to run the paper over the sharp edge of a table, and that will put a slight curl into the paper before rolling it. And I recommend using either the water spray or the table edge technique, but not both at the same time. Number 2, how glossy or coated is the paper? Glossy paper can be used, but it can be a bit slippery. Also, once you get it rolled and you add the glue has no tooth to sink into, so it may take longer for the glue to set enough to hold the bead from unraveling when you let go. This is the same for plastic paper like bottle labels, vinyl paper, Cricut machine paper, or some calendars. Number 3, how stiff is the paper? If the paper is too thick, such as cereal box paper, the cardboard can be so stiff that it won't bend. I've seen it done, but personally I haven't had much luck with rolling beads with cereal box cardboard. Number 4, how is the pattern going to look when it's rolled? So remember our rule of thumb number 1, the last 1.5 inches of the strip will be the most visible on your bead. Now for the tapered beads, there's a little add-on to that rule of thumb. And that is for the tapered beads, you will also show the outer edges of the paper strip. So for example, on tapered beads, such as a bicone or a barrel bead, consider not only that 1.5 inch of the last part of the strip, but also what colors are going to show on the edges of the bead. All right, and now we're getting ready to start our fun project. But before we do, let's go over a few troubleshooting tips for rolled paper beads. So this is just a magazine page I pulled out to demonstrate some problems that can arise when making rolled paper beads. The first one is ugly or wrinkled edges. If the bead edges look rough or wrinkled, it could be caused by cutting with scissors instead of a razor knife and ruler. It can also be if the razor knife isn't kept flush against the ruler while cutting, or if the blade is angled downward too sharply, which can tear the paper. So when cutting, we always want to make sure the flat of the blade is parallel with the cutting board. If the strip is wide enough, we sometimes can save the bead by unrolling it and trimming the rough edge and then re-rolling it, but the bead will generally be slightly thinner than before. Another problem is the paper may slide out from under the ruler. When you're cutting a strip of paper, if the paper slips out from under the ruler, it could be one of two things. Either the pressure on the ruler was not tight enough, or there wasn't enough paper under the ruler for the ruler to hold on to. To fix this, make sure that there's enough paper under the ruler for the ruler to grab onto, and hold the ruler down hard when cutting the paper. Another problem can be getting air gaps between the layers instead of a smooth roll, and it's usually because the strip either was not pulled tight enough while rolling or the paper strip was not centered while rolling, and that can make little air pockets like this. So it's not a nice smooth bead. If we catch it happening, we can stop rolling and roll backward to the point where it was still even, and then continue rolling forward again while keeping the strip snug. We want to keep gentle tension on the strip so that the paper stays snug against the bead the whole time while keeping the paper strip centered. Another possible problem is the beads can come out lopsided or the edges don't line up, and this usually happens when the strip drifts off center while we're rolling. If we notice it early, we can stop and roll backward a little until the strip is centered again, and then continue rolling forward. If we're making the bead with flush ends like a tube bead, we also want to use our index finger to gently guide the strip edge while we roll. And if the glue was just added and the end is still loose, we may be able to lift the end and unravel it a little and re-roll it straight. Another problem that can arise is if the bead end is sticking up. It's usually because we didn't get enough glue all the way to the very tip of the paper. To fix it, we can use a toothpick to apply a tiny amount of glue just under the tip and then press it back down and hold it until it sets. This can also happen if we didn't hold the end down long enough for the glue to set. If the glue is still fresh, we can often save the bead by lifting the end, reapplying a small amount of glue, and then reaffixing it neatly, and then holding it for a few extra seconds. Another common problem is sometimes the bead won't slide off the tool. To prevent this, we want the strip to be snug while we're rolling it, but not pulled so tight that the bead locks onto the tool. Most of the time, we can loosen it by twisting the tool back and forth slightly. However, sometimes, especially with very wide beads, it can be too much friction there to remove the bead without damaging it. And in that case, we may need to carefully lift the glue end and loosen the roll, then slide off the bead. And the last troubleshoot I want to go over is paper unraveling. If your paper unravels, it's usually because the paper strip is not being held tight enough and it slips out of grasp. Sometimes you can pull the paper in and make the paper strip tighter and continue, but if it came unraveled and it slipped off the roller, then we just need to start again, making sure that the paper is snug while we roll. So here are four paper bead shapes that we'll be making in this project. We have our tube bead, which is long and slim. We have our drum bead, which is short and fat. We have our bicone bead, which is our tapered bead that comes to a point. And we have our barrel bead, which is a tapered bead that comes to a straight tip. We'll be using different paper, but we're going to make all of these, plus one of them will be used for a layer styled bead technique, which I'll explain later. The purpose of this project is to practice different measurements and cutting different widths of paper strips, different ways of making tapered strips of paper, rolling the beads properly, and making 5 different styles of beads. For this project, you can use whatever paper you want, but if you'd like to follow along with me, I have two pieces of paper here. One that is a pretty paper, which is a piece of scrapbook paper, and another plain paper that complements the colors of the pretty paper, and this is just colored cardstock. And to start, I'm going to cut the pretty paper first. So here's what we're going to cut for this project. One strip that is 3/4 inches wide by 11 to 12 inches long of pretty paper. One strip at 1/2 inch wide by 11 to 12 inches long of plain paper. One strip at 1/4 inch wide that's 3 inches long and pretty paper. Now, of course, you can use pretty paper for all of them or plain paper for all of them. It is your choice. All right, so we've already gone over how to measure. So we're going to start with the 3/4 inch paper strip. And to measure that, we're going to turn our paper over so we can mark the measurements. And we're going to find our 3/4 inches on the ruler. And this is 1 inch. And the middle, there's a 1/2 inch. So we know that right in between there is that 3/4 inches. So we line up the 3/4 inch mark to the edge of our paper and put a little mark. And then down here, we'll do the same thing. Now we have two marks at our 3/4 inches, and all we're going to do is line up our ruler to the two dots. And now before we cut, remember that we need to hold the ruler down tightly and glide the razor knife along the edge of the ruler. And this paper is a bit thick, so I'm going to cut it a second time, holding that ruler down really tight. And I felt a little catch here, so I'm going to go over it one more time. All right, and there's our 3/4 inch piece. We're going to set that aside for the moment. So now we're going to do our 1/2 inch strip. So we flip over to the back side and mark our 1/2 inch. And we find our 1/2 inch on the ruler and line it up to the edge of the paper and mark it and slide it up a ways and do the same thing. Mark a 1/2 inch. And now we have our dots to line up our ruler for our cut line. And this cardstock is a bit thicker paper, so I'll have to score over it a couple of times to get all the way through it. Holding the ruler very tight and then let the ruler be our guide. One more time. Okay, and there's our 1/2 inch paper. Now this 1/2 inch paper is going to be tapered, and there are two techniques to tapering paper. One that makes the bead taper to a point, called a bicone bead, and one that makes the bead taper to a straight end, called a barrel bead. First, I'll show you the barrel method. So we want this paper to be a 1/4 inch on one side while the other end stays at a 1/2 inch. So on our ruler, let's find a 1/4 inch segment. So we know this is 1 inch and this is a 1/2 inch, and we want the 1/4 inch, which is this line right here. So we place our 1/4 inch segment on the bottom of the strip and center it smack in the middle of the width of the paper. And we're just going to mark the beginning and the end of the 1/4 inch segment with some dots like this. So we're going to cut from the right dot to the right corner at an angle. So we line up our corner at the top and line up our dot at the bottom, and holding the ruler very tight, we slide the razor knife along the ruler to slice that. And again, it's thick paper, so I'm going to score this a second time. That side is done. Now on the other side will be the same thing. But if I hold the ruler like this, there's no paper for the ruler to grab onto, so it would slip out from underneath while we're cutting it. So if I flip this the other way, then I can cut from the opposite side. And now the bulk of the paper is under the ruler, so it won't slip around. So again, we line up our dot and line up our corner and slice along. All right, so here we have our strip that's tapered to a straight end, which will make our barrel bead. And this is the front side, so we won't see the marks on it. Now when we go to roll this, because it is thicker paper, it will most likely make bend lines if we don't prep it. So first we want to pre-curl it, and you can do that by sliding it over the edge of a table. And so that you can see, I'm going to pretend this ruler is the edge of a table, and I'm going to press gently down with a finger or thumb while sliding the paper over the edge. Just kind of let it curve. All right, so we have this nice little curve here already started. And because this is really stiff paper, you see how it's already bent here? So it's going to need a little extra help. Because this is so thick, even though we curved it a little, it's going to make little bend lines if we try to roll it any further. So you can see that in this paper. What we can do is take a little spray bottle and lightly mist the back of it. And I have to do this off camera. So one little spray up here and down here, just enough to make it damp, and then I'm wiping it off immediately. And what that does is soften the paper just a bit to make it a little easier to roll without bend marks. So let's start rolling this while it's still damp. And we slide the strip into the slot here and get it started. And you see it's not making bend marks. And as we roll, we pull it really snug and then keep it really centered. And you see how it tapers down as we go. And then we add our glue, making sure that it gets to all the edges. And then we slide with our fingertip to slide off the extra glue and slide to the middle of our finger to hold pressure on it until the glue sets. And I just take the glue off my finger with my other hand and wipe it onto some paper, or you could use a baby wipe. So the barrel bead has this nice flat area in the center of the bead for us to add another layer. Now let's set this to the side and cut our second layer. So now we need our 1/4 inch piece, and we only need it to be 3 inches long. So using our pretty paper, we measure our 1/4 inch. So here's our 1 inch, here's our 1/2 inch. So we know that this is our 1/4 inch just before that 1/2 inch. And we line up that 1/4 inch on the ruler to the edge of the paper and make our mark. Then we slide up a little bit and mark a 1/4 inch again. And we want to mark 3 inches so we know how long to make the strip. We're going to line up the dots to make our cut line. And I'm going to cut a little longer just because I feel like it. And we make our cut line at the 3 inch mark and cut it. And so here is our 1/4 inch piece that is 3 inches long. All right, let's come back to our barrel bead. Now our barrel bead is basically completed, but I'm going to show you a technique called layer styling to make a layer styled bead from our barrel bead. So you see this nice flat area in the center? This is where we're going to overlay our 1/4 inch strip that's 3 inches long to make our layer styled bead. A layer styled bead is basically a combination of one bead, which can be anything that's got a flat area, along with another strip of paper laid over that to stylize the bead. Now the easiest way to do this is to brush on some clear drying liquid glue with a small paintbrush, making sure that it reaches all the edges of the strip. I'm being lazy here, I'm just using my glue bottle because it's what I had. But just make sure that you have plenty of glue, especially to the tail end of the strip. Now we're going to place one end of the strip right in the middle of that flat area and hold it for a few seconds until it starts to stick. And then very carefully we want to wrap it around, making sure that it stays center and wrapping it all the way to the end. And the ends should line up on the left and the right edges so that it looks like one strip. And now we have our layer styled bead. Now, as I said earlier, there are two ways of making a tapered paper strip. I showed you how to make a paper strip that tapers down to a straight tip, making our barrel bead. And I'm going to show you how to make a paper strip tapering down to a pointed tip, which will make our bicone beads. Now, technically, if you wanted to, you could use the same technique we used for the barrel bead. Instead of putting that little 1/4 inch dot to dot, you can put one dot in the center at the end of the strip centered on the width, and then cutting from the dot to the opposite corner of the paper strip. But that's too much work. There's a much easier way. What we're going to do is take our 3/4 inch strip and cut it in half diagonally. And then that will give us two equally sized paper strips of the same width. So let's take our 3/4 inch strip that we already cut and lay it face down on our table. And we're essentially cutting this in half diagonally, but if we actually cut corner to corner, the point is so skinny that it may break when we're cutting. So instead of cutting exactly corner to corner, we'll be cutting off corner to off corner. I'll explain. If we were to go corner to corner like this, you see how skinny and frail the skinny tip is? If we slice the paper this way, it'll most likely crunch up or tear when we slice. So instead, we're going to slide the ruler just slightly inward and give that tip a little bit of a tooth. And also the same on the bottom side, sliding the ruler inward just to give a little bit of a tooth. So each point is a little bit away from the corner, and that's what I mean by off corner to off corner. And now we can hold our ruler tight and slice along the ruler, and maybe a second time just to make sure that it cuts all the way through. So now we have two tapered strips, both with pointed tips. Now you might find that on a thicker strip that the wide edge might have a slight angle, and you can always trim it so that it's nice and straight, which helps our bead roll straight. These came out pretty straight, so I think they look pretty good. Now we're going to roll these up. So we take our rolling tool and get it started, and we just keep wrapping it around, keeping it centered. If we start to go off center, then we roll it backward a little bit and then recenter it and roll forward again. And it's very important that it stays centered, especially for tapered beads. At the end, the strip is very skinny, so it's easy to slip out of our hand. So just make sure you hold it tight. And then we glue our tip, let it set, and slide it off. And that finishes that bead. And we'll repeat that on the last strip. So just rolling it up, centered, gluing it. And as you get used to this, you'll find that it goes much faster. Just start slow until you feel comfortable with it, and then the speed will come automatically. Okay, so here we have our set of three, our layer styled bead in the middle, and two smaller bicone beads to complement it. And now that you know how, if you wanted to, you could even do two more small beads for the outer end of your necklace. So now we've learned how to make tube beads, drum beads, bicone beads, barrel beads, and a layer styled bead technique. So let's talk about decorating our paper beads. So there are many ways to decorate our paper beads. Some ways are done before the glazing, and some are in the glazing itself. This is a technique I use from time to time. Since the edges of the paper are usually white, that makes for the edges of our bead to be white. This is a nice way to add a little bit of color. You can use colored or metallic markers or colored or metallic ink. So this is an ink pad with gold ink, and this can get a little messy, so I'm going to put on some gloves. Now you see that the edges are very white, and what we do is just slide the edges of the paper across the ink pad. You may not see it much now, but wait for the ink to dry, and when you roll these up, the sides of the beads will be gold instead of white. Now we already talked about layer style technique, and this is another technique you can use. If you use white or light colored paper for the paper strip layer, you can decorate the paper strip and add more character. So here I'm using a metallic pen and just getting it started. And then I'm just going to put some little tiny dots all the way around. And that just gives it a little more decoration to it. Another fun decoration is using nail stickers. They can be purchased on Amazon and they come in all kinds of colors, including metallic. And these are just a few that I already had, so I'll show you how I use them. They just peel off, but it really helps to use tweezers. To get it started, we place one end on the bead where we want it, and then gently press it down so that it sticks. And in case you're wondering, this is called a torn edge tube bead, which is another paper bead shape that I'll be covering in my next video on paper bead shapes. Sometimes the stickers can be stubborn and the tweezers can't quite grab them, like this one. So once we get the edge lifted, we can carefully grab the sticker and place it. And we're just adding a little here and a little there just to accent the bead. Too much gold can make it look crowded and messy. I need something up here. All right, and that's not plain and boring anymore. Using nail stripping tape is also a nice way to add color. Now this is a triple tube bead that I'll be showing how to make in my next video for paper bead shapes. But for decorating, I wanted to show you this. So the paper stripping tape is available on Amazon. It comes in huge arrays of colors and patterns, including metallics. This one is a hologram purplish blue color. It's very, very thin tape, but you can see how it's got that iridescent shine. So this blue bead is very plain, and we can spruce it up by putting some stripping tape. We find the edge and lift it up, and then place it right in the middle, one stripe for each blue section, and wrap it around. And this is just a little sparkly accent to give the bead some character. One more here in the middle, and one more on this one. Now the tape isn't super sticky, but it is sticky enough to hold it in place. And then once we glaze the bead, it'll lock everything down and bring out that shine. And now it's not just plain blue anymore. Now when you have beads that are pretty plain color, sometimes you might want to just spruce them up by adding a little more color. And these are water-based colored markers with brush tips. What I do is I pull out a few colors that will complement the colors that are already there. And then I just draw some lines. To draw lines, we would lay the pen tip on the bead and then roll the bead without moving the pen. Or you can just color in certain areas randomly and just add color wherever you want. You can add a touch of metallic marker as well. And that's another way to spruce up the paper bead with color or metallic accents. Now I strongly recommend finishing off the ends of your beads either with some grommets, also called eyelets, or bead caps, or pearl cup eye pins, or something. These strengthen and finish off your paper bead and make it more like jewelry. And additionally, I recommend glazing your bead with UV resin or varnish or embossing powder. Glazing will make the bead strong and water resistant and give a finished professional look. If you'd like more information on grommets and glazing, you can check out my video tutorial for Upgrade Your Paper Bead Creations, which covers more explanation of these techniques. Okay, to recap, we've learned about different types of bead rolling tools, such as bead rollers and household tools that we can use, along with how to use them when there is a paper slot or not a paper slot. We explored many types of papers that we can use for the paper beads. We've learned several techniques such as measuring, cutting, rolling paper beads, how to purposely adjust the paper bead strip to adjust the width and thickness of the bead, compensating for thin paper by multi-layering, decorating, and troubleshooting. We've also learned how to make 5 different styles of paper beads: tube beads, drum beads, bicone beads, barrel beads, and layer-styled beads. In my next video, I'll be covering more on paper bead shapes, so keep a lookout for that one. And remember, there are also videos on my channel for other non-rolled paper bead shapes, such as box beads, long box beads, pyramid beads, and the newest, hexagon beads. And if you'd like more ideas for paper beads, be sure to check out the paper beads in my shop at julscreations.com. So here are some more decorative ideas for your paper beads. You can use different papers such as origami, scrapbook paper, magazine pages, or your own printed paper. You can print your own colored paper from digital downloads. You can add touches of colored marker before glazing. You can add thin metallic markers like dots and wavy lines. You can run the edge of your paper strip on color or metallic ink pad. You can paint a pattern or flowers with acrylic paints for color. You can add nail stickers or nail striping embellishments. You can add end pieces such as grommets, eyelets, pearl cup eyelets, and bead caps. You can use nail foils with adhesive to add patches of colored foil. You can cut out tiny prints such as flowers and glue them onto the bead. You can glaze your bead with UV resin, varnish, or embossing powder. You can use different types of varnish such as matte finish, satin, or glossy. You can add fine glitter or mica powders to your varnish. You can add 1 or 2 drops of acrylic paint to your varnish for color, and whatever else you can dream up. The options are limitless. Before we wrap up, I would love to hear from you. What kind of paper do you like to use for your paper beads? Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please give a thumbs up. And if you have any questions or video ideas, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you'd like to be notified when I release new videos, be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support my channel, you can buy me a coffee using the link below, and that helps cover supplies and filming time and keeps new tutorials and free templates coming. A big thank you to my subscribers and supporters. I truly appreciate you. There's also a link below to all of my Jules Creations pages if you'd like to explore more. Enjoy and never be bored.